column for The Telegraph and teaches history, as Amartya said, at the Jamia Millia Islamia University in New Delhi. His talk is entitled Second Republic, and please join me in welcoming
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Monto and Ashok for this wonderful invitation to speak at this conference. And I'd especially like to thank Professor Manigaria, who did this wonderful non-text bound, lucid talk about economic rationality and how it ought to be implemented in the context of new government. Let me say straight away that my talk, and this is the burden of the historian, is likely to be more querulous, less certain in its premises and what follows from those premises. It's called a Second Republic, and there's a question mark at the end of that title. And the reason why the talk has the title it does is that starting in 1848 in France began to mark transformative periods in its politics by giving each subsequent era a new number. And the French are currently on their fifth republic, we are on our first. So I thought the idea of the numbered republic was a kind of useful metaphor for exploring the possibility that the 2014 election might mark a kind of remaking of the nation in spirit, if not in letter. I think to try to understand whether this election marks, in a sense, a reconstitution of the republic, either metaphorically or literally, I think we need to do three things. First of all, and this is, in a sense, a historian's talk, so if you will bear with me, we need to try and understand the nationalism that defined the first republic, so to speak, the republic that was constituted in 1950, and the one that, in a sense, is still in business now. So we can measure the extent of the BJP's disagreement with the political culture and the nationalism that constitutes this republic, which might help us gauge how a republic remained in the image of the BJP and Narendra Modi, because let's remember that one of the great takeaways of this election is the fact that you have, for the first time, the BJP unfettered by the compulsions of the coalition in office. How far a republic remained in the BJP's image would depart from the principles, the practice, the nationalism of what I choose to call the First Republic. The second thing I think we need to do is, more narrowly, we need to place this election in the context of the electoral history of India over the past quarter of a century. In terms of this history, is this in fact a watershed in our political history? If it is, what are the changes that it has brought about that makes it transformative? And thirdly, if this is a watershed election, what is Mr. Modi's agenda for change likely to be? And here, I'm obviously not concerned with the economic agenda, because I'm not qualified to speak about it, but I'm more concerned in a sense with the political initiatives and departures that Mr. Modi and the BJP might make from, if you will, the common sense or the political common sense of the First Republic. So I begin with the first part of this three-part discussion, which is what do we mean by the nationalism of the First Republic? I mean, every definition of nationalism begins with the assumption of some kind of homogeneity, the sense of people growing together, knit by some sense of common identity or purpose. Now this common identity, if you look at the templates of European nationalism, is almost always based upon the idea, not always, but generally based upon the idea of a shared language, sometimes buttressed by the idea of shared religion, a shared ethnic or racial origin, or even a constructed notion of history, a history that you have in common that links you together in common purpose. So regardless of whether the need for a nation state is predicated on a kind of romantic nationalism based on notions such as blood, soil, and spirit, or a more civic nationalism based upon Republican ideals like anti-clericalism, or indeed notions of civic fraternity, homogeneity and sameness are the bedrock of most nationalist tendencies. So whether it's a civic nationalism like France, which is systematically hostile to the idea of the intervention of religion within the state, or whether it's a nationalism like Germany, which in a sense is more willing to deal in notions such as blood and soil and spirit. The notion of homogeneity, of uniformity, is central to the templates of European nationalism. I want to propose here that the Indian Republic, or to put it another way, the house that the anti-colonial Congress built, which we assume is a nation state, and is in fact a nation state, doesn't invoke uniformity as its constitutive principle. And this is not surprising, because the political mobilization that preceded, in a sense, the setting up of the Republic was dominated by a party that spent 60 years and more, from 1885 onwards, learning how to represent not so much the idea of homogeneous self, but, in a sense, the census diversity of India in an almost zoological way. So the Congress was born in 1885, in the Hymn of the Raj, just under 30 years after the rebellion of 1857. And in 1877, 8 years before the Congress was actually founded, the Conservative Viceroy of India, Lord Lytton, organizes a darbar. It's worth remembering that the 1870s are also the decade in which the colonial state begins its decennial census, in which the colonial passion for pigeonholing and labeling Indians finds its ultimate expression. And in the darbar of 1877, in a sense, Lytton metaphorically arrayed the census diversity of India in a single campus, so that this diversity could pledge allegiance to the Queen Empress. The darbar, in a sense, invited people to see it as a temporary zoo, assembled to embody the boundless reach of its colonial keepers. And there's a lovely story about Srinivas Banerjee, one of the early leaders of the Congress, being so impressed by the darbar, the ability to bring together this diversity under a single roof, that he dreamt of an assembly of Indians as diverse, brought together not to pledge fealty to the crown, but to, in a sense, represent the diversity of India. I'm not sure the story is apocryphal, but it captures an important aspect of Congress nationalism, the nationalism of what I described as the First Republic, the way in which it embraces the colonial tabulation of society and then claims to represent India on those terms. Now, the Congress in its early years bases its claim to be a proxy for India. And remember, India at this point is a subcontinental nation the size of Europe without Russia. We're talking about undivided British India. So it's an act of extraordinary impudence and hubris when you consider that this is a political organization that meets once a year, has no organization, has no cadres, essentially is a bunch of largely Anglophone, middle class or elite Indians who meet annually and pass resolutions. And if you look at its name, there's a redundancy built into it. It was the Indian, and just in case you missed the point, it was the National Congress. So in a sense, it bases its claim to speak for India on the diversity of its own membership. It seeks out members from every sort of India's human species. And by doing this, the party lays proprietary claim to the diversity of India. So if you look at the way in which it performs this diversity, and it literally performs it, it's very careful, and you can read the correspondence of this time to see that it's very careful, to have a Bengali followed by Muslim, followed by Parsi. There's a sense in which, since its claim to represent India is based upon it representing the human species of India, it's very important for them to actually get this right. Now, this self-conscious pluralism is actually based on weakness. The Congress recognized that it really has no claim to speak for India. It's a small, elite annual gathering. It is incapable of any form of mobilization. It is overwhelmingly English-speaking and middle-class, which India is not. So to argue its case to a skeptical Raj and to potentially its various constituencies within India, the Congress uses the census's metaphor of a human menagerie, of India as a kind of human menagerie, to propose, as I said, a zoological nationalism. It followed that if the Congress was to be a nationalist vessel, it had to be, if you will, an arc. The Congress was essentially arguing that it had a right to speak for the subcontinent because it had two of every kind on board. This is, as I said, a pluralist nationalism, born out of weakness and anxiety because it's deeply aware of its frailties and its vulnerabilities, of its limited constituency, its limited appeal. Its pluralism, to start with, is as much a stratagem as a principle. But it's a stratagem that I want to argue is historically important and I'd say beneficial. It has beneficial consequences for the practice of the Indian Republic that it creates in the middle of the 20th century. Its willingness, for example, to deal with difference without hysteria, its acceptance of the fact that even in a democratic republic, sometimes one size does not fit all, are consequences of this early pluralism. This representational maneuver, because that's what it is, this Noah's Ark nationalism, is one part of the Congress's singular nationalism. The other part of the kernel of its nationalist project is its quite remarkable attempt to replace the identity politics that supplied the ballast of European nationalism, especially the romantic nationalisms of Central Europe in the 19th century with their invocations of blood, language, soil, faith, and history, with what can only be described as secular grievance. I don't mean secular here in the sense that we use it in India today, I mean secular merely in the sense of not being denominational. So to put this another way, a national movement's claim to self-determination is generally based on a definition of the self in question. But the dominant tendency in the Congress is that it does everything it can to duck the defining of an authentically national self. Why does it do this? It does this because the Congress recognizes early on that the homogenizing templates of Western nationalism just don't fit a subcontinental polity. It's like stuffing Bharat Mata into petticoats made for smaller European women. The language communities on which the nationalisms of the 19th centuries were based, European nationalisms in the 19th century were largely based, offered very little guidance in the context of, for example, the subcontinent's dazzling linguistic diversity. Nor was the European habit of inventing a past or a history in which the prior life of the nation could be theatrically represented useful, given that any concocted version of history that you came up with was likely to annoy large chunks of the population that the Congress wanted to represent. People tried. Even congressmen tried. Some nationalists saw, for example, a proto-national progenitor in Shivaji, his struggle against the Mughal Empire, and the Maratha notion of a Hindu Pankaj. But this, as you might imagine, the Congress early recognized would be a hard sell for people who weren't, in fact, Hindus. Because it is so hard to prove a national essence for India that appeals to everyone, the Congress needed to put something in its place. Because there's a sense in which if you don't have history, you have to have grievance. All nationalisms are predicated, in one way or the other, on grievance. What was this grievance going to be? In the remarkable books written by R.C. Dutt and Dadabhai Naroji around the turn of the century, books essentially which ought to be described, I mean, Christopher Bailey describes it as a kind of statistical liberalism, Bibi Chandra describes it as a kind of economic nationalism. In these books written at the turn of the century, 15 years after Congress is founded, we can see what the Congress finds as a substitute. The emotional charge of Congress nationalism was to come from an economic critique of imperialism, not the myth of a suppressed identity struggling to be born. If Indian nationalism was to be fueled by the grievances of victimhood, the Congress wanted to make sure that all Indians were cast as victims of economic exploitation. So, for example, the leeching of India through the drain of wealth, the destruction of livelihood as a result of deindustrialization. Whether these critiques of deindustrialization were true or to the point is not the point. The point is that rhetorically what you're trying to say is that the colonial state impartially exploits you all. The crippling of agriculture by high tax demands became hardy staples of the Congress's nationalist rhetoric. Because these arguments taken together could show how colonialism ravaged all Indians and how therefore they could make common cause against it. So Muslim Julahas and Jat peasants and Bohra traders and Parsi industrialists were theoretically knit together by anti-colonial grievance. In economic nationalism, the Congress found a non-denominational way of being patriotic. It's important to say this because there's a tendency to stigmatize the Congress's pluralist nationalism, and I want to emphasize the Congress I'm talking about is the colonial Congress, the anti-colonial Congress of the late 19th and first half of the 20th century. There's a tendency often, retrospectively, to stigmatize the Congress's pluralist nationalism as a set of imported and therefore alien, deracinated ideas. The idea that the Congress is a bunch of Anglophones basically busy translating John Stuart Mill and Renard in their heads and coming out with derivative prescriptions. On the contrary, I would argue that Congress nationalism is a home-brewed pluralism, radically at odds with the premises of European nationalism. And in fact, ironically, the nationalism that is in fact derivative of European models is the Hindu nationalism that supplied the Mahasabha, which supplied later, as Pankaj mentioned, the predecessor of the BJP, the Bharatiya Janata Sangh, and the BJP, with in a sense its nationalist genealogies and its nationalist credentials. Pioneered by organizations like the Hindu Mahasabha and the RSS, by Hindu-leaning nationalists like Aurobindo Ghosh or Veer Savarkar, and Hindu ideologues like Gurji Gulwalkar, this was a nationalism premised on the invocation of homogeneity typical of European nationalism. The difference here was that the glue holding the nation together was religion rather than language. I mean, this is in a sense obvious given the diversity of the linguistic diversity of the subcontinent. Though it's important to remember that the first political arm of the RSS, Bharatiya Janata Sangh, tried to combine the idea of a constitutive religion and a constitutive language. There's a sense in which the rhetorical power of European nationalist precedents is so important. The notion of a homogenizing nationalism is so critical that there is that slogan, which those of us who are old enough to remember will remember, that famous slogan which was Hindi, Hindu, Hindustan. So key was this nationalism to distance itself from the nationalism of the Congress. And I think the point to be made here is there's not one nationalism in colonialism, there's several. There's Muslim nationalism of the sort that Jinnah sponsors, there's a kind of Hindu nationalism which in a sense comes from outside the Congress and also from within the Congress. There is a stream within the Congress. In a sense, this kind of broadly ethnic Hindu nationalism, if you will, is sometimes an alter ego to the pluralist nationalism that I've sketched out for you. That this pluralist nationalism remains dominant both within the Congress and within colonial India, but these other nationalisms actually exist. Hindu nationalism is, of course, fundamentally majoritarian. Its arguments oscillate between a benign majoritarianism where minority populations are honored, yes, with complete rights, to a hectoring Hindutva sort of nationalism of the sort specified by Gulwalkar, for example, in the 1930s, and more lately by Subramanian Swamy, which demands deference from minorities and threatens recalcitrant minorities with sanctions that include, and this is genuinely bizarre in the context of a republic of the 21st century, the withdrawal of political rights that allow family succession. So Swamy, updating Gulwalkar for 21st century rights, quote, implement the Uniform Civil Code, make the learning of Sanskrit and the singing of Vande Mataram mandatory, and declare India a Hindu Rashtra in which non-Hindus can vote only if they proudly acknowledge that their ancestors were Hindus. Rename India Hindustan as a nation of Hindus, and those whose ancestors were Hindus, unquote. I mean, it's not hard to argue that Subramanian Swamy is a man. Therefore, it's not hard to argue that he's something of an outlier in any party that he chooses to belong to. But it's worth pointing out that he appears on television regularly as a representative of the BJP. And there's nobody in any position of authority within the BJP that has made any disavowal of Swamy's statements. And I think it's important to remember that it's not just Swamy. Even the matter of Gulwalkar, who said something even more shocking than Swamy did in the 1930s, in a famous book called We, the BJP is embarrassed by what Gulwalkar wrote, but instead of acknowledging it and making a comment about it in terms of, this book belongs to a certain time and so on, it does a kind of opaque denial of the whole business. So I'm suggesting to you that there is a very real sense in which there is a majoritarian nationalism which varies from a kind of benignness to a kind of malevolence, which informs, if you will, the political horizons of majoritarian parties like the BJP. Now, this is the nationalist tradition that animates the RSS and the BJP and Narendra Modi. I think it's fair to say that it differs so radically from the anti-colonial nationalism of Congress, this pluralist nationalism that through a mixture of compulsion and idealism it arrived at, that it isn't surprising that Narendra Modi and the BJP coming to power with an absolute majority provokes misgivings about the nature of this republic going forward. So this is, in a sense, the first part of this discussion, which tries to understand the ideological distance between Republican nationalism as the Congress instated it in the middle of the 20th century, and Hindu majoritarianism which developed a kind of parallel tradition right through this period, a subterranean, perhaps not hegemonic tradition, but which now has, in a sense, the opportunity to, in a sense, be hegemonic. The second part of the talk basically tries to place the 2014 elections in sort of historical context, tries to understand why they are, in a sense, significant. So, in terms of India's political evolution, how significant is the 2014 general election? You know, in parliamentary democracies, incumbent parties are replaced all the time. It's routine. So why should we attend to the deserved destruction of a dysfunctional dynastic party, utterly discredited by its corruption and ineptness? I think the short answer to this is both the unprecedented scale of the BJP's victory and the Congress's defeat. So I think the first question is, how does the 2014 election compare with elections past? Now, you know, given that the BJP moved, there are a whole bunch of things that are truly remarkable about this election. I mean, it's hard that if you did a Dhoni list of what is remarkable in this election, it would be the size of the toilet roll. You know, for example, the BJP moves from less than a fifth to nearly a third of the national vote since the last general election of 2009. This is the first time the BJP has topped the Congress in terms of vote share. It's the first time it's achieved an absolute majority in the South. The first time that any party has avoided the necessity of coalitions since 1984. The first time the BJP has made significant gains in the East and the South. And of course, the first time that its ideological enemy in the Congress has been reduced to a sub-50 seat round. The BJP's supporters, both the members of the party as well as commentators sympathetic to the party, have understandably reached for the most impressive precedents they can plausibly invoke. So Sujit Bhalla, for example, insisted in an article that this election was historically more significant than the 1977 post-emergency ouster of the Congress, which I think is borderline bizarre, because 1977 marked both a liberation from the Republic's only encounter with authoritarian rule at the center, and it was also the first time since independence that a non-Congress party actually took over the national government. I think more plausibly, BJP spokesmen have claimed that this result represents the best performance by any party since that mother of all victories, the Congress tsunami of 1984. Now, it's worth noting that the Congress in 1989 got nearly 40% of the vote, nearly 9% more than the BJP manages in this election in 2014, but managed less than 200 seats. One possible way of looking at this would be to try and make a comparison in terms of vote share, for a moment putting the number of seats aside. But I need to say here that I'm not trying to make some elaborate case that in a first past the post-parliamentary democracy we should see vote share as a more legitimate proof of a mandate than seats. Clearly seats are more important than vote shares are. But if you're looking at the way in which the electorate responds to a party election, a vote share is a useful way of looking at it. Let's look at, I think in some ways, a relevant comparison is the 1991 general election. The vote share percentages between 2014 and 1991 are almost a neat inversion of each other. The Congress and the BJP basically changed places. Since we are talking about Modi wave, let's just look at what the percentages were. In 1991, Narasimha Rao became Prime Minister on the strength of Congress performance that saw it win just over 36% of the vote, 5% more than the BJP share of the vote in 2014. The BJP won just over a fifth of the vote in 1991, the Congress won just under a fifth of the vote in 2014. But I don't think the takeaway from this is that in some way there is no Modi way. There clearly is a Modi way. This is clearly a blowout victory. The point I want to make is that this comparison seems plausible, but it's actually misleading because it compares two sets of election results without looking at the trends they represent. If you look at the trends, what you see is that from a high of nearly 40%, as I said, in the 1989 election, the Congress declines in 1991, an election that occurs within 2 years, to 36%. And then by 1996, after a full term is served by Narasimha, it declines even more sharply to 28%. And basically from 1996 up to 2014, the Congress is basically leveled at around 28%. There are minor fluctuations. So for example, in 1998 and 1999, the Congress dips to 26% as the BJP spikes when it forms a government. But broadly speaking, the Congress plateaus in this period between 1996 and 2014, regardless of whether it's in office or outside of it. The BJP, on the other hand, has a completely different trend. In 1989, the BJP has all of, I think, 11.5% of the national. The Congress, remember, at this point has 39.5%. This climbs, this doubles in a sense by 1991. The BJP makes it to about 20%, the early 20s. And like the Congress, it plateaus out and in the early 20s all the way up to 2009. In 2009, it dips a bit, it's about 19%. But basically, what the BJP manages in the 90s and the 90s is to move from 10% of the vote in 1989 to a fifth of the vote, and it's a fifth that it controls. The BJP has a fifth, the Congress broadly has a little more than a fourth. What happens, however, is that both these parties plateau out, the Congress a little higher in terms of vote share, the BJP a little lower, but in 1914 you have, in a sense, the trend. The plateau ceases to be important, the BJP spikes to 31%, the Congress declines to 18 point something%. So there's a sense in which the Congress starts from kind of election out, it slides, it levels off and plummets. And if you were to plot this on a blackboard with chalk, this would literally be for the Congress, the writing on the board. Apart from how the percentages stack up against each other, and apart from the destinies, the fortunes of the Congress over this period of 25 years, if you look at just this election, it racks up so many unprecedented results that it's hard to keep track of. I think one of the most important is the blanking out of the BSP. Remember, the BSP wins 6.2% of the vote. It has the third highest percentage of